Tonight, however, we welcome Onur Öztürk. Onur Öztürk is an assistant professor of art history in the Art and Art History department here at Columbia College, Chicago. Originally from Ankara, Turkey, he received his master's in architecture degree from the Middle East Technical University and a PhD from the University of Texas at Austin. Onur's current research focuses on the built environment of Asia Minor, modern Turkey, and Chicago. In addition to the projects introduced tonight, he studies 13th century funerary monuments of the female elite in Kayseri. Is that Kayseri? Sorry, should have gotten the pronunciation on that earlier. And prepares digital drawings for academic publications. Dr. Ozturk also teaches global art history and visual culture courses, including Art of Islam, Art and Ritual, and Rethinking Museums. Dr. Ozturk will be joined by discussant Lisa Ayla Çekmak, PhD, Chair and Curator, Arts of the Ancient, Mediterranean, and Byzantine, at the Art Institute of Chicago. Please help me welcome Onur Öztürk.
All right, how are we doing this evening? Good. Isn't that such a lovely day? And I'm so impressed you guys did not skip class. I would totally skip today's class because, I'm like, Onur, I can take one of his classes next semester and enjoy this amazing day. But you are here, so that's great. So you better sign that attendance, so get that credit you truly deserve. As my colleague introduced me, my name is Onur Öztürk, and today I'm talking about dismantling persistent myths, revealing intertwined histories. Now thinking this is a little bit of an overwhelming task to accomplish in a little bit more half an hour. But what I'm really talking about today is two recent projects that I am currently working on. But before I jump into that, I would like to express my gratitude to Philip von Zweig, wonderful colleague, my chair, Duncan McKenzie, my colleagues, Taylor Hookanson, Amy Mooney, Deborah Parr, Mel Potter, who have been, Nikki Nolan, who have been all super supportive throughout the years. And I notice this is also my first public lecture, if I don't count the Brownback lecture I gave right after, literally the day after the 2016 election. Not everybody was in the mood that day. I don't know why. Everything turned out to be fine, as you know, in the following 6 years. But since this is my great chance to talk to Columbia College community at large, I thought before I jump into two parts of my talk today, which is talking about our book project, as well as my recent research on the Balbo Monument, I would like to talk a little bit about my background. I am originally from Ankara, Turkey, as Philip mentioned, but I actually grew up in another town of Turkey called Amasya, and the spelling is right there. Amasya is a lovely town. The population, even today, is now around 70,000 people in a valley. And I grew up with fascinating history and monuments around me that included more than 2,000-year-old Hellenistic tombs carved into the mountains, Ottoman mosques and Selçuk shrines and tombs, and also the beautiful vernacular architecture, incredibly diverse population that includes different sects of Islam, interesting juxtaposition of political views. And now, at an age that I'm not going to reveal right now, as I reflect on my life so far, I feel like that must have been one of the moments that triggered my interest into built environments and all this kind of fascinating, layered, complicated history that in the context of Amasya. And, if you look at all these sites, LinkedIn, our faculty profiles, you see all kinds of things like architectural historian, assistant professor, and all of that. And I find those funny because those are other things we invent to create some kind of authority and power, right, in the context of education. But if you really ask ask me who am I would say I'm a perpetual learner. I am a very curious student, and I wanted to be a student forever. And I think academia is a good track if you are thinking about like doing assignments and homeworks for the rest of your life. That's a good track. So I am a perpetual learner. I'm constantly curious about things. And as I'm curious about things, one of the things that I am really curious about is the constructedness of things around us. I am trying to understand how our cultures around the world, historically and contemporary, are creating constructs of gender, class, and power. And I'm trying to reveal that. And part of it is, I think, because of my intersectional identity. I come from Turkey. I'm an immigrant scholar. I am from the Middle East. Middle East in itself is a construct, so we are finding for some better ways of expressing that, like West Asia. But also living in the United States now for 20 years. I came here right after 9/11, so it is kind of interesting for me to think about constructedness of things. And I feel like many global art historians, I am in a privileged situation to look at things from multiple sides, revealing the little things of an illusion, so you can see the forklift guy behind the curtain, pretty relaxed, by the way, doing all the levitation. Look at him, he's so relaxed. But I think in that kind of thinking, there are multiple scholars, theoreticians that have been influential in my scholarship. Just to name a few, of course, there are many, and they change based on the project I'm engaging with, using those theoretical lenses appropriate for the project. But I'm especially great fans of history scholars, Roland Barthes and his concept of myths. These things impose on us as the truths, right? Truths of race, gender, class. And that's a very useful way of looking at things for me. Michel Foucault, and especially his writings on power, constructs of power, negotiations of power. And of course, that's not shocking, but Edward Said and Orientalism, especially this whole concept of us versus them, West versus East, right? That is central to my scholarship. So with that brief background about me, let's go into a little bit details of these two projects I'm presenting you today. The first one is our book project that took roughly 3 years to wrap up, and we published it last March. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. And next, I'll tell you a little bit about the Balbo Monument. So as I get excited, I want to make sure I'm going to grab my notes right here so that I can actually remember a couple of names and dates. And that's exactly why I never test my students on those, because I can never memorize those kind of things from memory. So Deconstructing the Myths of Islam started 3 years ago, but really it started actually here at Columbia College Chicago in 2013. And Dr. Amy Mooney was actually one of the people who pushed me to develop an Art of Islam course specifically for Columbia College Chicago. And I was very privileged to be given freedom to think about this in a kind of progressive way. And eventually, I met another colleague, Xenia Gazi, who shared very similar interests with me as I met her after one of my public gallery talks at the Art Institute of Chicago. So together with Xenia, initially we started this project as a CAA panel. And we basically did not want to feel alone as scholars of Islamic art. We were constantly frustrated with the myths associated with Islam and Islamic art. And we were hoping that colleagues around the world would answer our call, and we can start a conversation about deconstructing some of those myths. Luckily, we had some wonderful colleagues coming and attending our session right before the global pandemic. We had a full room, and that actually excited us. So we wanted to move to the next level, which is basically creating a publication for this. For that purpose, we wanted another colleague who's a little bit more experienced in terms of being an editor, publishing a book. And that colleague was our colleague from Australia, and that is Sam Bowker, a lovely man who's so passionate about Islamic art, specialized in Egyptian tent makers, and he joined us, and we then got hit by COVID, right? And in a way that was very frustrating. It was so easy just to give up and move on with our lives, but we embraced that moment as a moment of opportunity, and we connected with our colleagues from 5 continents, from 12 different countries, and we actually took advantage of the new reality we were engaging. So we created a project where the whole group meets, and then individual groups of the book meet regularly. Everybody give feedback to each other because we were low on budget. So we were wanted to create this kind of supportive environment. And that turned out to be really good. We even wrote our introduction as a conversation piece, which turned out to be great. And for our foreword, one of our great colleagues in our field, Wendy Shaw, wrote a foreword for us. She's also the author of the book, What is Islamic Art? So we are super happy about that. So our book actually contributes to the discussion in the field of Islamic art, particularly in the context of classrooms, museums, scholarship, and creative practice. And we are actually building on earlier publications, including Islamic Art and the Museum and curating Islamic art worldwide. And for that purpose, we invited our colleagues to address how universities, museums, and other educational institutions can continue to challenge stereotypical or homogeneous notions of Islam and Islamic art. So I want to talk about couple of projects that ended up here. As you can see, we start with some practices in the context of scholarship. One of my favorite is Cleo Canton. I specifically asked her to write a piece about Africa because Islamic art in Africa gets discriminated in 2 ways, because in Islamic art it's excluded as being African. In African art, it was traditionally excluded as being Islamic. So Cleo Canton wrote a beautiful piece about this, also reflecting on her career as an Islamic African art scholar. So other papers focus on curatorial practices in the context of museums, but also educational practices in the classroom. And finally, we also invited curators and artists who are involved with contemporary art and how they tackle this topic, the topic of deconstructing the myths of Islamic art. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the book, but honestly, if you are really curious, you should read it. And here is a great opportunity for you. Our wonderful librarians, huge fan of library here, actually acquired an electronic version of the book if you are interested. So you can go tonight and you can download chapters. You can print up to 60 pages if you really want to. Sorry, trees. But, this is available for you through the library. 3 of you can read at the same time and you can take turns. Okay. So take advantage of that. But I want to highlight a couple of my colleagues' work because it's fascinating to me. One of them is, for instance, a young scholar, Juan de Lara, and his chapter actually tackles the myth that the Arabian Peninsula, specifically the Hijaz region, did not belong to late antique world and did not share its artistic and material culture. Ironically, this perspective is both Eurocentric and Islam-centric because it kind of functions both ways, isolating the birth of Islam from the Mediterranean world and then focusing on later borrowings or appropriations in Islam. De Lara argues that The actual process is much more complicated, and acculturation experience in Arabia, particularly between Islam and Hellenistic cultures, started a long time before the Umayyads, and in fact, before and during the formation of Islam. So basically, he's saying that the evidence is there, but if you are too lazy to go and find it, you can jump into this kind of conclusions. But Arabia was part of the classical world, including the so-called late antique world. Another favorite is Dr. Nur Sobers Khan, the former director of the Documentation Center at the Aga Khan Center at MIT. She wrote a paper to us about an exhibition that never happened at the British Library. And her article is actually a little bit long, but we let her do it because she didn't have images, but also it was a fascinating paper. And in this process, she talks about how institutions all about diversity, equity, and inclusion until that directs back to the institution and starts criticizing the institution itself. And she talks about how this can be in itself, even a failed exhibition, a learning experience. This is an amazing article, but also the article that made me most nervous because the British Library was very curious and wanted to read the article before it was out. And when they finally contacted us, it was already out. We are like, buy the book, you read the article, enjoy. I had some sleepless nights right after the book came out because I don't know I can handle British Library in a kind of court situation, but thank God nothing happened. So don't tell them, okay? So we are totally okay with the current situation. My colleague Patricia Blessing, very, very productive scholar in the field, wrote specifically about textiles. This is actually very fascinating because in her article, she talks about the multifunctional aspect of textiles in all these Islamic societies as garments, as space creators, as all these kind of functions, but also talks about how the museums, specifically European and American museums, collected these textiles in a way that has nothing to do with their original functions, but more as samples or patterns, and how things literally split into little pieces and spread to European museums. So it is a fascinating article about collecting and interpreting Islam in the museum context. Also, Ashley Deming is one of our colleagues who wrote extensively about the current trends in curatorial practices. Her article also talks about the whole dilemma of what do you name your Islamic art gallery? What is an appropriate way of approaching it when you recognize the term Islamic art in itself is also a European innovation, an innovation of 19th century. But, there should not be an excuse to shut it down. So how do you handle that in different contexts? So my colleague Sam Bowker also wrote an article, and as a scholar who's teaching in Australia, he tackled the center-periphery myth. This is a myth that is actually a major myth in any fields of art history, because there is a long tradition of thinking about any major art historical movement as this kind of sun rising from the center and putting its rays around it, where the peripheries are considered significant. But that's basically not true, right? If you look at different movements, there are all kinds of different things. If you look at early modernism and architecture, you can actually see all kinds of different variations happen. Just studying Germany exclusively is not going to help you to understand all these different attitudes. So in a similar way, Sam talks about how you integrate that when you are teaching in a place like Australia, where your students are primarily from South Asia, and where, you are talking about Islamic art, but your collection that you are working with at the museum is primarily from 19th century and onward from those lands rather than the traditional Iraq, Egypt, Turkey, and all those kind of locations where Islamic art collections are primarily from. So in the third portion of the book, we have colleagues, curators, and artists talk about contemporary practices. one of my favorites is my colleague Karen Greenwald's article about Hamra Abbas. Hamra Abbas is a Pakistani-British actually, artist who deals with issues of colonialism, heritage, ownership, and engages with a variety of fascinating work. So if you're interested in these topics, definitely look her up. But in her article, Karen provides some great insight into Abbas's practice. But also we invited a local Chicago artist, Sami Ismat, who's originally from Syria, practiced in London for many years, but also a Columbia College faculty member, part-time faculty member at the theater department. And Sami actually wrote us an article from a creative's perspective. And in his article, he talked about how his techniques as a practitioner and how he handles the expectations and engages with that from an artist from the Middle East. And one of the things that really stuck with me is working close with Sami and also reading his variations of his article is he talks about how there's an expectation from the artists from the Middle East to create like interlacing patterns and calligraphy, right? But he tells us that as a refugee, he had to deal with pages and pages of papers and this kind of photographic imagery that involve. So he's much more familiar with the bureaucratic kind of expressions compared to this kind of traditional exotic artistic expressions. So he uses those kind of techniques and specifically the technique of parafiction in his performative work. So that's just a brief summary of what the book is about. In my own chapter, I specifically tackle the teaching of Islamic art in our undergraduate education in the United States, specifically art history survey courses and upper level Islamic art courses. And my chapter is a little dark. It starts really dark. So if you read it, just be ready for it, okay? Don't do it like, maybe not good for tonight. Maybe after a good sleep, you can do it. Because it starts with tackling some of the recent events head on. And very specifically, this obsession of the alt-right movements, white supremacist movements in recent years, with the traditional formation of art history, which goes back to late 18th, early 19th century. And in this context, I talk quite in detail, which I'm not going to go into too much tonight, but particularly movements like Identity Europa, where they literally take images and examples from art history textbooks and argue the superior white heritage. They also borrow the word heritage in that context and impose on us. And right around the same time, we also have Mr. Trump's executive order about the classical beauty, which very much recreates all this linear, Eurocentric view of art history as its origins in ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, really takes off with Greece and Rome, and then revives with Renaissance and gets even better with neoclassical art and architecture, and finds this most expression with people like Thomas Jefferson in the context of United States. This is too much to unpack in this kind of lecture, but basically this kind of linear rhetoric of history that we have been teaching for more than a century in our classrooms is feeding into this kind of problematic white supremacist narrative. And I basically argue that this is not okay. And I hope you agree with me. And I basically argue that as a part of the decolonizing education movement, we should think about how we teach these courses, including how we teach Islamic art in those courses, because we are basically fueling this kind of problematic narratives. So in that regard, my chapter looks at particularly the evolution of art history survey. And basically, what I found out that is initially, at the beginning, art history survey is interested in all kinds of cultures and civilizations. But the attitude was always colonialist and orientalist as a field that evolved in Europe in late 18th, early 19th century. And gradually, it became Eurocentric narrative of linear perspective that is still very much prominent with a lot of our textbooks and a lot of our survey courses. And what happens is you keep adding all of that, Islamic, African, Asian, pre-Columbian, but because the system, the narrative is Eurocentric, it just emphasizes, right? It just strengthens that kind of narrative. So one thing I did is I look at all the art history textbooks we have right here at Columbia. And that was kind of like, what I had access at that point as well in a global pandemic where a lot of collections were closed. And what I discovered was actually pretty consistent. Islamic art is only a fraction, right around 3% for all major art history textbooks. And there are all these common patterns. They're always at the same location, right after Byzantine art, right before medieval Europe. Discussion of the birth of Islam is always included with a map. Primarily objects from the major European collections and American museums are combined with monumental buildings. And also there's an emphasis on mosque architecture and quote-unquote luxury objects. And here is Islamic world, which is interesting compared to rest of the world. So Islamic art has this kind of unique function in this kind of otherizing Eurocentric narrative. There are the quote-unquote others, but there's also the other within the European narrative, that's the Islamic world. And here is the typical textbook with an introduction, of course, always started with religion, and the map of a unified Islamic world, and then built on that, also with this concept of luxury arts. Other common patterns, very little change in newer editions. Edition after edition. Kerry James Marshall comes to the cover. Awesome, I love it. But the book is still crap, okay? It's still the same book. Emphasis on religious spaces and luxury arts, that's also consistent. For 30 years, I looked at. Luxury arts almost exclusively used to discuss non-architecture examples of Islamic art, presenting as a dated medieval tradition. What is interesting is that's not done with some of the other examples that could be put in the same category. So there's kind of fascination with exotic, basically, what I'm hinting at here. So after all of this, I initially wanted to cut to the bottom of this because I especially discovered that these books continue to perpetuate the idea of a static East versus progressive West, which kind of links us to the second part of the talk. And also, it's a continuation of Hegel's notion that world history travels from East to West, okay? As Hegel puts it, as the sun, this is kind of poetic, although very problematic, but it's poetic. As the sun rises in Asia, it sets in the West, but it's in the West that the inner sun of self-consciousness, which emits a higher radiance, makes it further ascend. This should be a song, right? This should be a racist song. That would be great. In this model, since bright and progressive modernity is reserved for the West, Islamic art transformed into an exotic art of the other, stuck in time, mostly noted for its anachronism and decorative elements. And in fact, that's how people think about Islamic art, right? Abstract patterns, calligraphy, which is a part of Islamic art. All myths may have some truth in it, but that's just a fraction of Islamic art that just simplifies the thing in a problematic level. And there are all kinds of problematic attitudes in our textbooks. I'm not going to go into all of this. This is just too much for the time. But just to give you an example, while discussing Jean-Auguste Dominique Anc's Grand Odalisque, the author describes Orientalism as a European curiosity about the decidedly non-Western culture of the East. Also interesting, Thomas Jefferson Plantation, this is still very prominent in a lot of architectural history books, is introduced as a country villa inspired by Pliny without mentioning the slavery, which would be a good connection with Romans because Romans slaved everybody. They were really good at that, right? So that would really build in. So you got the point. Our textbooks are terrible, so we need to think about this and we need to change it. And everybody is now getting the message, I'm hoping. You never know. The waves change. That actually caught a lot of attention as Yale department decided to scrap his survey course after students reacted to that, right? But we were actually way ahead of the curve. We actually taught all these problematic aspects of our survey courses and replaced it with a course called Introduction to Visual Culture, which some of you may be taking or may have taken, that focuses on critical thinking, theory, rather than all these problematic linear narratives imposed on art history survey courses. But the problem is, I love Introduction to Visual Culture, but it doesn't really address this complex time frame we share as the citizens of the globe, historically and contemporary context. And all these complicated events like slavery, for instance, is then missed, right? It can be still addressed, of course, but that chronological framework also is useful. So that's what we are missing. So to get to the bottom of this, I actually decided, let's just go to the very first edition of Gardner. And that's actually fascinating because Helen Gardner is a Chicago art historian, a scholar at the Art Institute of Chicago. And her book is actually amazing. It actually covers all kinds of world cultures and civilizations, but also very much creates all these problematic structures we are talking about. She actually dedicates 2 chapters to Islamic art, but she's at least honest in terms of this otherization that's still very much prominent in our books. In her book, there's a very clear attitude of us as Europeans, Americans, European Americans, and them. And that pops up in the chapter focusing on China, but also pops up in the context of Islamic art. And it's incredibly racist. I'm not going to go into all the details of it, but there's a lot of like cliches here of the invincible soldier and going to paradise and all of that is a discussion of the Islamic art. But this emphasis on us versus others, at least spelled out without quoting it. So basically what I'm arguing is it's still the same text. We are just whitewashing, no pun intended, to reveal all those problematic aspects of the narratives. So what happens then if you move up? Then when you try to teach Islamic art like I try to do, part of your task becomes undoing the damage of a survey course, right? Then you are usually the lonely person because this is a huge field where you become a representation of that huge field. And chronologically and geographically, it becomes almost impossible to cover. And you jump into this kind of problematic center versus periphery myths we mentioned earlier. Coverage is usually ended around the 17th century, which is another interesting discussion because, that's because original Islamic art scholars were mostly medievalists. So my proposal is, as we rethink these courses, is first of all, maybe we don't need the books, right? We can actually take advantage of our evolving technologies and open sources and collaborations among colleagues. I have been collaborating with my colleagues in Smart History, for instance, which is a great open source that is much more progressive in nature and inclusive. There are many of our museums actually have been doing some great work to share their scholarship. ArchNet, in terms of Islamic architecture, is another great source where a lot of resources are available to students with extensive timelines. My colleagues at Michigan started an initiative called Kamsin 3 years ago, where scholars around the world contribute with some video projects. So there are a lot of resources available. And making these resources accessible and available to all our students is a way of addressing some of these questions I posed earlier. Also, we should think about all these cross-cultural interactions. For instance, in the context of Islamic art, you always discuss Islamic art influence in Europe, but European influence on Islamic art is rarely mentioned. Here is a Baroque mosque for you. This is Nur Osmaniye Mosque from Istanbul. Look at this amazing Baroque dome and the cornices coming together, right? It can help us to think about the constructs of art history and what art history studies and what it doesn't, right? We have a lot of colleagues here specialized in crafts, specialized in built environments, right? So it's interesting to think about what we name as art with capital A versus small a. Islamic art can actually help us to address all of that. And on the screen, I'm showing you Al-Jazari's amazing machine that included a series of water clocks and where everything started moving based on that. And is this a design object? Is this an art object? Traditionally, this is not considered an art object, but this is an interdisciplinary art in my opinion, right? So it actually opens up some interesting questions. Discussions of power, discussions of different expressions in Islam. Prophet Muhammad told us, don't build tombs. They built so many tombs all around. And I grew up with them. And that's something we should spell it out. We should talk about in our classes. Byzantine artists building for the Islamic monuments, sometimes traveling across the Mediterranean to go to Spain and creating calligraphic form. This shouldn't be just Islamic arts focus. It should be something we should all learn about because these are the intertwined histories that actually help us to understand that our histories are all connected, right? And in that context, this influence of Europe on Islamic art on Europe has been known in scholarship since 1940s, but it's rarely spelled out. And there is a clear reason for that because, a lot of us are in our own fields. It's just inconvenient, but this is something actually really helpful to know about and to explore. In a similar way, Middle East and Asia is an interesting one. Ottoman artists created these amazing tiles, but their inspiration was China, specifically Chinese porcelain that people like Suleiman was obsessed about. The guy had like 20,000 pieces of Chinese porcelain. So his artist created this amazing blue and white clay tiles and eventually added colors like tomato red, which in return influenced the Chinese artists to create multi-color things. And the Europeans were fascinated with all of that and they created their own versions of that. And I know that complicates things, but it's also helpful to understand all this global connectedness that happened way before colonialism and way before definitely 21st century. So in that regard, acknowledging artists is important. The subject matter, Islamic art doesn't have to be religious. Reza is one of my favorites. He created all kinds of interesting depictions. And also thinking about these artists, fascinating with classical antiquity. Sinan, for instance, was obsessed with Hagia Sophia, a 1,000-year-old monument during his time. In a similar way, Abul Hassan studied Albrecht Dürer, right? These are interesting. These actually help us to look at east looking west, west looking east, and it actually shows that these are not isolated artistic movements. There are examples of that in some cases, but most of the time it's much more complicated. So in that though, I also have to mention for this kind of education to be really decolonized, we also give power to our students, right? And that needs some, intense one-to-one work with our students in smaller classrooms where they initiate the projects, they explore what they want to, and that builds on especially the scholarship of bell hooks. So that concludes my talk.